My name is Morgan Ellis, I'm 28, and the last words my mother ever said to me before I left home were, "You're dead to me." It happened on Christmas night, right at the dinner table, between a bowl of mashed potatoes and a forced family prayer. If you had asked anyone in our small Ohio town, they'd have told you my mother, Linda Ellis, was the perfect woman. She ran the church bake sale, chaired the PTA, and could turn a family photo into a press release. But inside our house, perfection was a fragile stage set held together by her willpower and everyone else's silence. Control was her language. She didn't shout, didn't threaten. She just rearranged reality until you forgot what you'd wanted in the first place. Growing up, she picked my clothes, my hobbies, even the color of my bedroom walls. When I got accepted to a college 3 states away, she cried for 2 days, not because she'd miss me, but because what will people think if my daughter runs off? I learned early that her love came with conditions: obedience, image, gratitude. And for years I gave her all 3. But by 28 I was suffocating. I'd spent my 20s in a job she chose for me, dating men she approved of, pretending the life she built fit me. It didn't. It was like wearing someone else's tailored coat. Elegant, beautiful, but impossible to breathe in. So that Christmas, when the family gathered in the same dining room where every argument of my childhood had unfolded, I made my choice. The house smelled like cinnamon and roasted turkey. Bing Crosby crooned faintly from the old radio in the corner. My dad was carving the ham, my brother was texting under the table, and my mother was smiling the brittle, camera-ready smile she reserved for holidays. I waited until the plates were full and the wine glasses had been raised. "I'm moving to Portland next month," I said. "I got a job offer." The clinking stopped. For a moment, even the music seemed to fade. Dad's knife hovered above the ham. My brother, Ethan, shifted uncomfortably. Mom's hand froze mid-air, fork poised over her plate, as if motion itself had betrayed her. "You're moving?" she asked softly. There was a tremor under her calm, the same one that always came before the storm. "It's a good opportunity," I said carefully. "An architecture firm downtown. I think it's time." Her eyes narrowed, the faintest smile curving her lips. "You think it's time?" She repeated the words as if they were a foreign language. "You're throwing your life away," she said finally, voice low but laced with venom. "After everything we've done for you." Her we always meant her. The family she claimed to protect was just a mirror she used to see herself reflected as a savior. I took a breath. My hands were trembling under the table. "Mom, it's my life. I'm tired of living it for you." For a second, she just stared, as though I'd spoken something obscene. Then with a slow, deliberate motion, she set her fork down and slammed her palm against the table. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. "You're dead to me," she said. No yelling, no tears, just finality. Clean, sharp, irreversible. Dad's eyes stayed on his plate. Ethan looked away. No one moved. The smell of turkey turned sickly sweet in my throat. Something inside me shattered quietly, not from the words themselves, but from how unsurprising they were. I'd always known, deep down, that love in our house had an expiration date. All I'd done was reach it. I stood up, the chair legs scraping the tile. My heart was pounding, but my voice was steady when I said, "Then I guess this is goodbye." She didn't answer. I walked upstairs to my room, the same one with the floral wallpaper she'd chosen when I was 13, the one that still smelled faintly of lavender and old secrets. I opened the closet and began packing. Each folded shirt felt like an act of rebellion. Every drawer I emptied felt like peeling off a layer of her control. I moved quietly, aware that downstairs the conversation had resumed. Clinking silverware, murmured small talk, the ritual of pretending everything was fine. I paused at the window for a moment. Snow was falling gently on the front lawn, covering the Christmas lights in a soft, glowing haze. It should have been beautiful. But all I felt was the ache of finality, the knowledge that once I walked out that door, there would be no coming back to the version of me she'd raised. When my suitcase was zipped, I took one last look around the room. Every picture frame, every decorative pillow, every perfect little detail, all curated by her, all meant to define me. And for the first time, I saw it clearly, none of it was mine. I rolled the suitcase down the carpeted hallway, past the closed door of my parents' bedroom, past the family photos lining the stairwell. My footsteps were silent, but inside, my pulse was roaring. At the front door, I hesitated, I wanted to hear her call after me to tell me to stay, to say she didn't mean it. But the only sound was the faint hum of the furnace and the distant ringing of Christmas bells from the church across the street. I opened the door. Cold air rushed in, crisp and clean, the kind of air that burns your lungs but wakes you up. As I stepped outside, the wind caught my hair, and for the first time in years I felt weightless. Behind me, the house glowed with warm light, a picture of holiday peace that would look perfect from the outside, but inside something had died long before I left. And maybe I thought that's the only way something new can ever begin, by finally letting the old, broken version of love stay buried where it belongs. Portland wasn't easy. It greeted me not with opportunity, but with rain, endless, gray, intrusive rain that seeped into my clothes, my shoes, and my resolve. My apartment was a converted attic above a pawn shop on Hawthorne, barely big enough for a mattress, a desk, and a single plant I was too tired to name. The pipes moaned through the night like they resented my presence, and the window, framed in peeling paint, let in more wind than light. But it was mine, the first space in my life that hadn't been chosen for me. I started at the firm 3 days after moving in. Ellis, right? My manager said without looking up from his coffee, already halfway through introducing me to a stack of blueprints taller than I was. No one bothered to learn my name for weeks. I was the new girl, the one who fetched printouts, checked measurements, adjusted details no one noticed but everyone relied on. In the evenings, I'd stay late just to keep the office lights on, not for ambition, but because I couldn't bear the silence of home. My phone sat on the edge of my desk like a wound that wouldn't close. I checked it constantly, almost ritualistically, during lunch breaks, bus rides, midnight walks to the corner store. I didn't expect an apology, not even a conversation. Just something small, a "how are you?" or "we miss you." But the silence from my mother's number was total. She had erased me with 4 words, and now I was living inside that erasure. Some nights, I'd scroll through old photos, Christmas mornings, family barbecues, birthdays with forced smiles and matching sweaters. Every image felt like a lie I'd once believed in. My mother's hand always rested on my shoulder in those pictures, the grip subtle but firm, like a reminder of ownership. It used to make me feel loved. Now it made me flinch. The loneliness came in waves, unpredictable, crushing. I'd wake up some mornings with my chest tight, as if the air itself had turned against me. I drank too much coffee just to keep moving, ate dinner out of takeout boxes, and told myself exhaustion was a kind of progress. There were nights I'd stand by the window, watching the city pulse below, and wonder if I'd made a terrible mistake, if independence was just another word for exile. But somewhere between the exhaustion and the ache, something inside me began to harden and reshape. Without her voice dictating every decision, there was suddenly room for my own. It was quiet at first, a hesitant murmur beneath the static of doubt, but it grew stronger each day I survived on my own terms. I started running by the river before dawn. At first, it was just to fill the hours, to chase the numbness. But as weeks turned into months, those runs became something else, a conversation between my lungs and the cold morning air. I learned the rhythm of my breath, the weight of my steps, the sound of my heartbeat when it wasn't drowned out by someone else's expectations. The water always mirrored the sky, gray, restless, honest. I began to envy it for its freedom. One Saturday, I joined a small volunteer group rebuilding homes for low-income families on the east side. The work was rough, blistering hands, splinters, sore muscles, but it grounded me. Each nail, each measured beam was a reminder that creation could come from ruin. No one there cared about my resume or my family or the absence that followed me around. We just worked side by side until our sweat blurred the lines between strangers. There was a man named Frank in his 50s who'd lost his own house years before. "You build enough walls," he said one day while handing me a hammer, "and you start learning which ones keep you safe and which ones keep you trapped." I didn't respond then, but his words lingered like the smell of sawdust in my hair. Slowly, I began to see the shape of a life forming, fragile, imperfect, but real. I rearranged my apartment, painted the walls a soft, forgiving cream, and bought a second-hand chair from a thrift shop. The plant by my window started to bloom. I named it Ruth after my grandmother, the only woman in my family who had ever lived on her own terms. At work, I found my rhythm. My sketches grew bolder, my lines more certain. When the firm approved one of my designs for a small community project, it felt like a quiet vindication, proof that I wasn't invisible. that I could build something that would outlast my fear. Still, some nights I'd catch my reflection in the dark window and see her, my mother, staring back through my eyes, the same curve of the jaw, the same stubborn set of the mouth. It terrified me, that resemblance. I'd whisper to the glass, "I'm not you," as if saying it aloud could make it true. But I think, deep down, I knew that part of her would always live inside me, the part that demanded perfection, that feared abandonment, that mistook control for love. The difference now was that I could see it clearly, I could name it. And maybe that was the beginning of something new, not forgiveness, not yet, but the first fragile blueprint of peace. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to be the daughter she wanted. I was learning how to be the woman I needed. 2 years had a way of reshaping a person without asking permission. When I walked into the office the morning the promotion came through, the city was just waking. A thin mist clung to the river and the metal ribs of the skyline cut soft silhouettes against a pewter sky. The email waited in my inbox like a small miracle. Lead architect, downtown redevelopment project, $12 million. I read it 3 times to be sure the words weren't a typo, then clicked through the attachments, the plans feeling heavier and more real than any I'd touched before. Not because of money, not really, because this was a project that would change the face of the city I'd moved to in search of a life that belonged to me. The promotion didn't arrive as fireworks. It was a quiet elevation, a handshake in the conference room, a congratulatory email copied to half the firm, a firm pat on the shoulder from my manager that felt like the nod of someone finally acknowledging the hours I had put in when no one else watched. I thought of the nights I stayed late, the blueprints spread across the floor, the cheap takeout on the windowsill, the way my hands had learned to steady themselves before a presentation. Every small, humiliating task I'd taken on to stay visible had added up to this. The $12 million figure was a number, but the promotion felt like validation carved into concrete. I bought a silver Audi that week. Practical, precise, unshowy, the nearest thing to a grown-up reward I could imagine. Driving it around Portland felt absurd and reverent at once. I would park by the river before dawn and sit with the engine cooling beneath me, running a hand over the leather steering wheel and thinking about how many small compromises had led to that moment. The car was not a rebuttal to my mother. It was a milestone in an argument I'd been having with myself for years. Posting the picture to Instagram was almost impulsive. From heartbreak to home, every brick of this life I built myself. I typed more to mark the occasion than to announce it to the world. I chose a photo of the Audi in front of a building I'd helped design, the winter light catching the glass like a promise. I expected the usual stranger likes and a handful of colleagues' emojis. I did not expect the ripple that made its way back to the place that had once called me theirs. When my mother's number appeared in the office notification, I felt an old, involuntary tightening, the one that used to precede every attempt she made to assert herself. I didn't answer. I let it go to voicemail like a test I wasn't sure I would pass. Her silence after our last encounter had been a kind of punishment that lasted longer than any slap. That silence had become a cold fixture of my life, and for 2 years I had learned to live in the spaces it left behind. Then, a week after the Instagram post, she walked into my office. She had always been impeccable. Even now, standing in the glass-walled entryway of a firm full of people she pretended not to know, she looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine's How to Do Control section. Hair exact, makeup minimal but precise, a wool coat that cost more than 1 month of my rent. Her lips were pressed so thin I thought at first it was an affectation. Her eyes, those familiar green-gray eyes of mine, were hard and bright with something I hadn't felt from her in a long time: fury. The receptionist blinked, unsure whether to intervene. A few heads turned. Architects who'd once joked about my permanent new girl badge now looked at her as if she'd broken the frame of their normal day. The office hums still to that peculiar point where everyone is waiting to see which person will do something first. I felt my own pulse slow to a deliberate count. For the past 2 years, I had built rituals to protect myself: early runs, volunteer days, nights cataloging the small joys that didn't need approval. But rituals don't inoculate you against the sudden return of the past. When Linda Ellis stepped into the fluorescent light and took in the room, I watched her move like someone landing on habit. There was performance in it, the posture of someone who'd spent a lifetime practicing disappointment. I studied her the way I would a building's facade, noting the outward perfection and tracing the fault lines beneath. What had driven her here? Shame? Pride? Shame at seeing her daughter succeed on terms she hadn't approved of. or the other, more honest motive I'd suspected for years. Control that had been shaken loose and now wanted to reclaim what it had lost. People like my mother equate influence with love. When one slips away, the other becomes unbearable. A dozen possible scenes unspooled in my head at once. A confrontation, an apology, a performance of piety that ends with a demand for me to return home. Each possibility carried the same kernel of heat, the knowledge that whatever happened next would test not only the life I'd built but the person I'd become during the building. I thought about how I would look to her, not the frightened child who'd once obeyed without question, but a woman who had learned the grammar of her own choices. I felt a quiet pride at that thought, and a tremor of fear that pride might be mistaken for arrogance. I remembered Frank's words at the volunteer site: "You build enough walls and you learn which ones keep you safe." I had been building walls for myself, not of isolation, but of clarity. Tonight, those walls would get their first real inspection. She paused at the threshold as if waiting for permission to enter further, and that tiny, ancient ritual made me angrier than anything she'd ever said. I wanted to tell her that permission was not hers to give. I wanted to say that she had been given her chance, and I had taken mine. But I didn't speak. Instead, I let the office fill with the sound of the city beyond the glass and the quiet, precise hum of people returning to work. I straightened a stack of my own blueprints on the corner of my desk as if arranging them would steady my pulse. My colleagues watched with the same cautious curiosity they would witness before any difficult meeting, expectant, unsure, leaning slightly forward as if to catch the first line of a story. When she finally met my eyes, there was something unreadable behind the fury, maybe recognition, maybe calculation. She stood like someone who had rehearsed many entrances into rooms like this, commanding, composed, certain she could still influence the narrative. I rose from my chair, feeling every year of the road behind me in the little stiff ache between my shoulder blades. My hands were calm. My voice, when I would need it, would be steady. For 2 years, I had been quietly, stubbornly rebuilding. In the space between the loss and this moment, hope had not been naive. It had been hard-won. What I felt now was not triumphant bravado, but the sober excitement of someone who has laid a foundation and finally sees the first line of walls that might last. She stood in the doorway, and for the first time in a long time, the fight between who I had been and who I was becoming moved from private rooms into the light. The next breath was on me. The office fell into a kind of brittle silence the second she crossed the threshold, like glass held at the edge of breaking, waiting for the right pressure. Linda Ellis moved through my workspace with the precise indignation of someone who'd rehearsed this moment in every mirror she'd owned. Her coat hung perfectly. Her expression was catalogued fury. She spoke before she reached me, letting the whole room hear the accusation as if it were a headline. "So this is what you left us for," she hissed. "An overpriced apartment and a car you can't afford." The words landed hard, not because they were true, but because they stung with the old currency: shame. In our house, shame had always been her bluntest tool, an instrument to straighten shoulders, to keep people behaving within the lines she'd drawn. She believed, I had come to see, that if she could shame you enough, you'd return to her fold, grateful for the correction. That belief had protected her from the disorder of other people's choices. It had also kept me small. My colleagues turned from their screens as if watching a play unfold. Some shifted in their chairs, guilty for being audience. Others widened their eyes, delighting in the office spectacle of private life made public. I felt the weight of those gazes like temperature on my skin, some hot with sympathy, some cool with curiosity. For a moment I heard nothing but the tight mechanical hum of the HVAC and the far-off clatter of a streetcar. "Mom, please, this isn't the place," I began, automatically soft, the voice my body had defaulted to for 28 years whenever conflict approached. I recognized the reflex and hated it. "You embarrassed this family, Morgan. Everyone thinks you've lost your mind." She snapped, each word sharp and measured. Her voice carried the old pattern, an indictment delivered as care. The barometer inside me shifted. I felt the old fear fold like paper, and then, like a slow tide, it pulled away. There had been so many rehearsed apologies in my life, so many ways I'd tried to compress myself to fit an image someone else preferred. Standing there with my hands curled around the rim of my coffee mug, I realized those compressions had cost me more than comfort. They had cost me discovery. Something inside me that used to tremble finally snapped. It wasn't an eruption so much as a shattering clarity. This was no longer about defending a departure. It was about refusing to hand myself back to the only person who taught me how to lose myself to appease them. "No, Mom," I said, and my voice held the unusual weight of someone who'd been practicing silence like a muscle and now chose to use it for strength. "I found my mind. I found my life, and you don't get to control it anymore." 1,000 small currents moved through the room at that sentence. My manager, a broad-shouldered man with a habit of smoothing his tie, sat up straighter. The intern who always asked me for help paused mid-email. Linda's face, so carefully composed when she'd entered, faltered as if someone had removed a prop she relied on to project certainty. Her lips parted, disbelief exposing vulnerability beneath the armor. The posture she'd kept for so long, chin lifted, spine rigid, quivered like a building hit by an unexpected tremor. For years she believed she could dictate the perimeter of my life simply by insisting upon it. The idea that I had been quietly rearranging my own map without her consent was an affront that made her visibly flinch. "I'm not dead," I added, lowering my voice. There was no need for spectacle now, just the plain, undeniable truth. "But the version of me who needed your approval, she is." It was a sentence that closed a door without slamming it. I watched the recognition ripple across her features, slow like heat through cold metal. For an instant she looked younger, not because time had reversed, but because the weight of expectation that had lived in her face eased even a fraction. It was not pity, it was the stunned admission that the architecture of our relationship had shifted beyond the repairs she had prepared for. She stood for a long moment, as if reorienting herself to this unexpected geography. Then she turned. Her heels clicked across the polished concrete like a metronome counting the end of an era. The sound was ordinary and absolute. She walked past reception, past the open-plan desks, and out into the city that had once seemed to validate her judgments. With each step, the office exhaled. When the door swung shut behind her, the ordinary noises of work returned like a tide. Typing resumed, someone laughed in a doorway at some minor private joke. The copy machine whirred. But there was an altered quality to the air, an aftershock that loosened something in everyone who'd witnessed it. A colleague I barely knew, Marissa from marketing, stood and crossed the room. She laid a hand on my shoulder, an uncomplicated human gesture that felt like the first solid plank in a bridge back to myself. My manager cleared his throat. "Morgan," he said, voice careful but not patronizing, "are you all right? If you need to step out?" I shook my head. "No, I'm okay." The truth of it surprised me. There was no shaky bravado, only a steadying conviction. I felt the coldness of the office chair through my jeans, the coffee gone lukewarm, the blueprint on my desk, my name on the title block, in black font that no one could erase. I did not feel triumphant in some ostentatious way. Triumph here was quieter, the steadiness in my hands, the clarity in my speech, the knowledge that my choices were finally anchored in my own compass, rather than someone else's map. Triumph was a structural thing, less fireworks and more foundation. Later, as people quietly returned to their tasks, respectful, awkward, curiously deferential, I found myself replaying the moment, and not with bitterness but with an odd, lucid sympathy for my mother. I could see her motives crystallized now. A woman who built identity around influence, and who felt displaced when her authority slid away. Her fury had been protection of reputation, of self. It didn't justify the cruelty, but it made her human in a way that invited neither absolution nor further entanglement. I picked up my pen and traced a line across the blueprint in front of me, the ink firm and deliberate. The line was not an erasure of the past. It was the next decision in a life I was finally designing for myself. The office hummed, sidewalk traffic murmured beyond the glass, and somewhere far off, low and steady, the city continued to turn. I breathed in, held the exhale until it left nothing but emptiness I could fill with my own plans. The confrontation had ended the way many endings do, not with fireworks or cinematic resolution, but with an ordinary, irreversible step into a new arrangement of life. As the day unfolded and meetings resumed, I felt the strange, clear brightness of someone who has stood up, said the truth, and watched the echo rearrange the room. The city lights of Portland shimmered through the windshield like a constellation rearranged by human hands, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a kind of quiet awe. I hadn't planned to stay in the car for hours, but I needed the pause, the space to breathe without someone else's voice echoing in my skull. My fingers traced the steering wheel absently, the leather worn just enough to feel like it had molded to me over time. It wasn't the car itself, My silver Audi wasn't flashy, and I didn't care, but it was the physical proof of decisions made and followed through. Every dentless panel, every careful line reminded me of a life built from scratch, unshackled from approval or permission. I let the tears come, not the kind that claw at your chest from grief, nor the ones sharp and salty from regret. These were the tears of release, the kind that leak when tension finally collapses and the body remembers it is allowed to relax. For years, I had thought freedom meant distance, packing boxes, and leaving behind people who claimed ownership over my choices. I had imagined myself like a bird in flight, always moving, always leaving. But sitting there, the skyline stretching out like a silent applause, I realized that freedom was something different. Real freedom was standing your ground, keeping your heart and mind steady while someone tried to yank you backward into old roles, old fears, old expectations. The day's confrontation with my mother had been the culmination of years of invisible tension, and in that moment of solitude, I finally understood the weight I had carried. It wasn't just about escaping her. It was about shedding the identity she had tried to define for me, a perfectionist daughter who must obey, appease, and perform. I had carried that identity as armor for so long, and it had been heavy, constrictive, and ultimately not mine. Releasing it wasn't a one-time action. It was the slow exhale after holding my breath for decades. A month later, a small envelope arrived at my studio apartment. I opened it hesitantly, expecting judgment, critique, or a demand wrapped in polite cursive. But inside, on the soft cream-colored card, there were just 4 words: "I'm proud of you." No apology, no signature, just those 4 simple words, perfectly spaced, perfectly written. My first instinct wasn't to call her or respond. I didn't need to. I didn't need to prove anything, nor did I feel any compulsion to reopen old wounds. That card wasn't about reconciliation. It wasn't about rewriting the past or rekindling control. It was acknowledgement, and sometimes acknowledgement, even in its quietest form, is the most profound gift. I understood then that forgiveness doesn't always mean reconnecting. Sometimes forgiveness is an internal realignment, a peace that allows you to walk forward unburdened, even if the other person never changes. I placed the card on my kitchen counter in the sunlight that crept through the blinds and let it settle there. It wasn't a trophy or a token. It was a quiet nod to the life I had constructed. For years I had measured myself by her approval, her fear, her judgment. But now I measured myself by every blueprint I drafted, every building I helped rise from nothing, every small success I claimed solely because I had chosen it. Looking out at the Portland skyline from my modest apartment balcony, I noticed how the sunset painted the high rises in shades of amber and rose, reflecting off the glass like a painter's brushstroke. These buildings were more than structures. They were milestones, markers of independence, testaments to the nights I stayed late at work when no one was watching, the mornings I ran along the river to keep my head clear, the evenings I volunteered to rebuild homes, giving life to places and people in need. Each light glowing in the distance reminded me of the countless decisions I had made, small and large, that built this life. I whispered to myself then, a quiet affirmation that felt almost ceremonial: "You built this, Morgan, and you did it without anyone's permission." The words tasted of finality and sweetness. They were mine alone. A statement of self-possession and ownership over the years I had lived in my own skin. I realized that rebirth isn't a single day or event. It's a process, an accumulation of choices, courage, and persistence. It's showing up for yourself when no one else will, and then recognizing that you are enough. I didn't feel triumphant in the noisy, triumphant way stories often portray. I felt steady, solid, like the foundation of a building that had been tested by storms, but now stood resilient, its integrity unquestionable. As the sky deepened into indigo, dotted with early stars, I let my hands rest on the balcony railing. I let the city hum beneath me, the life I helped shape in full view, without anyone's shadow looming over it. And for the first time, I understood that inspiration isn't always loud or performative. Sometimes it's the quiet, unwavering recognition that you have risen, fully yourself, from the ashes of someone else's expectations, and that nothing and no one can ever take that away.